You guys will time yourselves?
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
Let's go ahead and start time. Today we stand in firm affirmation of the resolution. The United States federal government should apply the Financial Stability Board regulations for asset ratios to all investment and commercial banking institutions. Quick definitions: the Financial Stability Board is a global institution that essentially makes recommendations for gives financial advice to countries around the world. Investment and commercial banking institutions are pretty much self-defined. Investment banking institutions participate in investment banking, commercial banking institutions in commercial banking, and within its borders in 2017, it's pretty much contextually defined. We're going to define today's round as a policy round. We're going to be weighing on net benefits today. Our plan text is as reads. Essentially, the Financial Stability Board recommends that the United States change its reserve ratios from 10% to 20%, essentially doubling the reserve ratios, which means the amount of money that banks essentially have to keep in their reserves will be twice as much, which means they're going to be investing less and keeping more safe and secure. So with that being said, does the NEG have any questions about the plan? No. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to 3 advantages, 3 reasons to vote affirmative today. Our first advantage is we're going to be reducing the chances of economic recession. The A point is that of the uniqueness or background information. And essentially, the median wage has not increased over the last few years, but the GDP has increased. So we can see the reason that this has been happening is because the financial market is going up. So while the financial market has been going up and there's been a lot of gains to the top 10%, real consumer demand isn't increasing. This is a main problem. So we see there's this bubble growing where the financial market is going up, but real consumer demand is not following with it. So our economy is starting to bubble up, and this bubble can burst. So the B point is essentially that of the link. We're deflating this bubble because we're reducing the amount of risky investments. What we're doing is right now, too many people are investing in the stock market is going up and up and up and up. So by increasing the Federal Reserve ratio, essentially we're going to be conserving more money. We're going to be reducing that less, and essentially the bubble will be deflating. So we meet real consumer demand, and we reduce the chances of economic recession. So the C point here is essentially that of the impact. Let's go ahead and look at the last economic recession's global impacts on the world. We had an $8.3 trillion wealth loss because of the 2009 economic recession. For the United States alone, our federal debt rose by $3.8 trillion. Household median income dropped by 6% as a result of this. In addition to that, 8 million jobs were lost globally. However, you have to understand this had plenty of global ramifications as well, because the United States dollar is the world reserve currency. Therefore, if the United States market crashes and the United States economy crashes, that's going to have a ripple effect throughout the world. So clearly, by reducing the chances of economic recession here, we already have provided compelling reason to vote affirmative. When valuing this in today's round, we ask that you apply the law of total probability, which essentially says the consequence of an event is the impact of the event multiplied by the probability it occurs. So even if we reduce the chance of economic recession by 1% by passing this policy, multiply these numbers, these detriments by 1%, and that's how much you should be evaluating the consequences in today's round. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the second advantage provided by the affirmative team today, and that's essentially that we're going to be increasing financial security for citizens in the United States. Starting with the A point of the uniqueness, we have a few background stories here. First of all, according to the Washington Post, an average of 1,000 baby boomers are retiring every single day for the next 20 years. So we can see a huge proportion of our population is actually retiring because the baby boomer generation, where we had a great population influx, is actually going ahead and retiring. So we see financial security becomes a priority in this sort of a world because these individuals, it will be very hard for them to go back into the workforce. So we should be valuing security of our money over making risky investments for small, efficient gains. So the B point is essentially that of the link. We're going to be reducing the chances of risky investments within the United States economy because, like we said, we're increasing the reserve currency. That means we have to reserve 20% of our currency instead of more of it. Let me give you some facts here. Currently, $36.9 billion is in the required reserves. Essentially, we're going to be doubling this amount of money. We have $31.7 billion in vol cash currently required. This is also going to be doubling. So the impact here is that we're going to have a minimum for the Federal Reserve to have $1.2 trillion in deposit. So essentially, they're going to be holding a lot more money in deposit. Therefore, there's going to be a lot less money pumped into the economy, and instead, we're going to be holding in our reserves. So we're going to be preserving financial stability and financial security. Now, go ahead and weigh this pretty heavily in the round because according to CBS 2014 midterm elections exit polls, 70% of individuals said financial stability was their #1 most pressing issue within the current economy. They believe the economy is the #1 priority issue, and within it, financial stability. So this ties back into our uniqueness story. Essentially, we have lots of baby boomers retiring. We need to preserve financial stability, and that's exactly what the affirmative team's plan is doing today. Now let's go ahead and jump into our third and final advantage, and that's essentially going to be of the global and international ramifications of implementing this policy. Let's go ahead and start by the Financial Stability Board. There are many countries that are currently advised by it and follow these policies. Some include India, China, Japan, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia. So we see a wide variety of countries around the world are actually being advised by this Financial Stability Board. In addition to that, European countries are also advised by the Financial Stability Board, and going to this background story where European countries right now are on the brink of economic collapse. We see a problem in the Eurozone right now where there's lots of countries starting to default on the debt, and the main problem we see over here in terms of the European countries is that they have a shortage of capital. They need more capital in order to go ahead and succeed. So the B point is essentially of the links. We're going to be linking to both stories here. So starting with the India, China, Japan, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia. Internal link number one, essentially if the United States is at a 10% reserve rate and they're at a 20% reserve rate, all the money will be going from their countries out into the United States, because individuals will find they can spend more of their assets within the United States. So they'll move their assets out of these countries and they'll go over to the United States, which will essentially be detrimental, A, to the United States because our economy is growing, and this bubble is going to burst, but it's also going to be detrimental to these countries which are suffering right now. And also apply that same internal link actually to the European countries that we see today. They're on the brink of economic collapse, especially with the issues in the Eurozone. We don't want capital to flow out of there, but that's exactly what's going to happen if in the status quo. Capital is starting to flow out of there into the United States. By instituting our policy, capital will stop flowing from the European Union to the United States, and that will help both preserve the European economy and additionally help preserve the United States economy. Because right now our economy is growing in a bubble. We want to deflate that bubble, and on the other hand, the European economy actually needs these financial investments. They need money to actually stay there. So essentially, go ahead and tie this back into our impacts of economic recession. We talked about how there was global ramifications in this. This $8.3 trillion wealth loss, federal debt rose by $3.8 trillion, household median income goes up 6%, $8 million jobs were lost. Essentially, if the European economy collapses and the United States economy collapses, and these economies in India, China, and Saudi Arabia start doing worse, we see significant global ramifications, and that essentially should outweigh everything in today's round, because on sheer magnitude, the affirmative team wins on net benefits. For those reasons, I urge the strongest affirmative ballot.
The order for today's debate, we're going to go first off case and then on case. All right. So as the negative team today in our round, we have a counterplan. This counterplan is to pass the plan and to follow the Financial Stability Board's regulations, with one exception. The exception is that we would exclude what are called socially beneficial investments. This has a legal definition. It's defined by basically Title II of the Dodd-Frank Act. Basically, these are defined as investments backed basically indirectly backed by the government that have a social purpose. So specifically, this includes things such as tax credits for renewable energy, tax credits for housing, that are technically not counted as safe, but that really are safe investments, and that the government considers to be socially beneficial investments. The Act of the Funding Enforcement for all normal fiends, the time frame for this plan basically is as soon as possible. And again, I'll reiterate that basically the issue here is that the standards used by the Financial Stability Board divide investments into safe and unsafe investments. So broadly, these are correct, except that investments such as renewable energy tax credits, basically what happens is you you install solar panels and you get a renewable energy tax credit, but you can't use that tax credit, so you sell it to a bank. And that is a completely safe investment that you have just made, because that tax credit basically is not going to fail. It's backed by the government. It's backed by the government giving you an assurance of a tax credit. But according to the Financial Stability Board's regulations, those are counted as unsafe investments. So these what are called socially beneficial investments, and again, this term has a legal definition, are counted as unsafe investments under the terms of the Financial Stability Board. And yet their failure rate is about 0.05% for renewable investments and far lower according to far lower for other kinds of tax credits. Basically, lower than most government investments, definitely should be considered within the safe category. I'll take any questions on the count.
We don't have them.
Okay. All right. So the first disadvantage to the plan, basically, is that we discourage investment in renewable energy. So let me just reiterate basically what I said above. Basically, that one of the key investments that drives investment in renewable energy is what's called a renewable energy tax credit, which is that when you invest in basically renewable energy or in solar, for instance, or in wind, you receive a tax credit in return. But usually the developers that receive these tax credits can't make use of them on their own. They're not small enough. They don't have a large enough tax burden to make use of them. So what's useful to them is they can sell these basically to banks and to other institutions as like a financialized, basically like an asset. And this asset is the tax credit. The problem is, as we've said, that according to the Financial Stability Board, they don't count these investments in safe, even though they have ridiculously low failure rates that put them well within the range of all the other safe investments. So the problem is, basically, the plan would impose these standards, the plan would impose these capital requirements, and what that means is that it would become a lot less profitable to buy renewable energy tax credits, because if you buy a renewable energy tax credit, and there's a requirement to also meet this capital ratio, then you would have to buy up other less profitable investments. You'd have to buy up government bonds and other considered safe investments if you want to buy up a renewable energy tax credit. So that means because banks aren't buying these credits will be worth a lot less to the companies that receive these credits, which means that the renewable energy tax credit incentive people have right now to pursue renewable energy would go down. Now, renewable energy tax credit is really key to our fight against climate change right now. According to the Congressional Research Service, it is the #1 reason that climate change is moving in the right direction within the United States. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, basically, if the United States does what it's currently doing with tax credits, and if Obama's plan goes through, then we will be able to delay the worst consequences of climate change. However, if you pass the affirmative plan, basically, you would neuter the tax credit. The tax credit's ability to influence things would be lost, because the tax credit is based on the ability for people who get a tax credit to then sell it to the banks that can use it. If you take away that ability, or if you make it less profitable for the banks to buy up these tax credits, they'll stop buying the tax credits. As a result, the tax credits will stop being worth as much, which means that we're basically worsening our fight against climate change. Climate change is the biggest impact here, because if climate change happens, what you can see is that the seas will rise, temperatures will go up. There are a couple of huge impacts. First of all, eventually we reach a point of no return at which algae, basically methane is going to start being released from ice, and methane is a huge greenhouse gas, which means that we will reach a point, and the affirmative plan would drive us off the point at which we basically can't go back, and the environment is doomed, which is a far larger economic impact than anything else brought up on the affirmative side, and also that eventually we'll reach a point where algae is going to overrun the ocean, which would basically reduce the Earth's supply of oxygen. That has huge economic collapse arguments, basically because it would collapse the ecosystem. Now, our second disadvantage here is that it would also weaken low-income housing. Because there's another credit here, what's called the low-income housing credit. And basically what this says is that if you build low-income housing as a developer, then you will receive a tax credit for that. So if you build housing and then you you let people buy that housing at a lower than market rate, you receive a tax credit for that. According to Novogradac and Company, which is basically like the leading consultant on tax credits, on housing tax credits in the United States, they said that 692,000 units of housing are produced each year in the United States, thanks to basically the low-income housing credit. The problem is very similar to the renewable energy tax credit, that if we do what the affirmative plan would do, buying up these housing tax credits, because again, if you build this, you don't necessarily have a use of this tax credit, so you sell it to a bank. But they would not buy, if banks buying up these housing credits also have to buy up government bonds at the same time to guarantee them to meet these asset ratios, it becomes much less profitable. They won't buy these housing credits, which means these housing credits will plummet in value. That means we'll see a decrease in the willingness of developers to build renewable housing, which means, first of all, that people will go without housing, people will go homeless, and also, according to the National Association of Home Builders, there's an economic multiplier effect where we gain about $30 to $50 billion each year from the fact that we have renewable housing and they have this tax credit. So if you get rid of the tax credit, you also get rid of the multiplier effect, which outweighs any other economic arguments in this round. Now, on to the affirmative case. So on their first point, basically, reduce the chance of recession. Again, we don't link into this. We've already explained the counterplan. All the counterplan excludes is basically this category of assets that, although they're not considered safe by the Financial Stability Board, are in fact completely safe assets. Their failure rates are far lower than most other assets that are actually considered safe. On the second advantage, basically about increasing financial security, we link in a very similar way because, again, the counterplan only excludes these assets that are themselves considered perfectly safe by everyone except the Financial Stability Board. So the fact that they don't fall into the legal safe category according to the Financial Stability Board doesn't mean they are not themselves a safe investment. So we're not increasing the chance of a crisis. Nothing that the counterplan does fails to claim their advantages. Basically, the counterplan completely claims the advantages while missing the disadvantages. Finally, the third advantage by global financial impacts, that a U.S. collapse could lead to a collapse in other countries. As I've said, we really do win this issue. In addition, you should just note that environmental collapse outweighs economic collapse, because economic collapse, what they're talking about, would be a one-time collapse, which would be followed by another bubble, and it's a cycle, whereas environmental collapse is a one-time thing that would do in the economy basically forever. So environmental collapse should be preferred to the biggest impact around. For all the reasons, we strongly urge a negative vote in today's round. Thank you.
Quick off-time roadmap. Essentially going to start with the theory shell, then going into the neg case and the F case. And let me know when you guys are ready. Yeah? You guys ready? All right, let's go and get started. Before I get started, I'd like to extend a blanket thank you for everyone for being here on this late Sunday night. Let's have a great debate. So essentially, we first want to run essentially a theory shell on their pick, essentially. So first, our interpretation that their pick that they brought up is bad, and the violation is they actually did go ahead and bring up a pick. So we have a couple of standards to go in and back this pick. The first is that of ground. There are an infinite amount of minuscule changes that can be made, all of the aft advocacy, and the pick allows any one of these to be manipulated. This infinitely skews the round in favor of the neg because it is impossible for the aft to win. Neg can simply pick any part of the aft's plan and essentially just go ahead and change it. We could get to the point where we're changing a comma. And we're changing a comma that leads to the voter of fairness. I'll get to that later, but that issue links to the voter of fairness. It's not essentially fair for them to come up here and run a pick. I'll get to that later. The second standard is that of shifting ground. See, I can't argue against the pick or turn it in any way because I'm just arguing against my own arguments in the first instance. So literally, they've essentially put clash to this one very, very, very minuscule topic. Essentially, they force clash into that, and I guess you can go to a third voter of destroying clash into that, and that will link it to education. So they essentially destroy clash by they pick essentially one topic we need to argue on in this. It was something that's socially beneficial. I'll get to how that's extremely vague, but it was socially beneficial, and they said we have to debate on that. This takes away from the education of the round because I'm here to debate the whole round in and of itself. My partner is here to debate the whole round in and of itself. And if the negation team comes up here and just picks to one very, very specific topic, and we have to debate on that, then that just doesn't lead to an educational debate, or as educational as it could have been if they just came up here and simply negated the plan or ran proper counter plan. The next is that of infinite regression, and that will go into fairness again. Infinite regression is very similar to that of predictability, and infinite regression says they could essentially change smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller parts of the plan. Again, that takes away from fairness. Then we go into predictability and prep skew. Essentially, we had to prep this case for 20 minutes. They essentially could have not prepped anything. They come into this round, they change one thing in our plan, and they run it as their own. That's a prep skew of 20 minutes, at least to a fairness. Both teams aren't getting the same amount of time to prep 20 minutes. And I think those are all the standards. Okay, with that, we go to a voter of fairness and education. Let's go first with fairness. Fairness is a prerequisite to education because debaters have a reason to debate. And if debate is inherently unfair, people will not want to debate. Second, fairness is fundamental because without it, we wouldn't have an objective evaluation of the round in and of itself. If we don't have an objective evaluation of the round, then no team wants to debate. If no team wants to debate, we don't have debate as an activity as a whole. The next is an unfair but educational debate cannot be resolved, but a fair but uneducated debate can be resolved. But again, we're saying we're voting on education as well, so that doesn't really matter. The second voter is that of education. We're essentially taking away from the educationality of this debate because of the infinite regression and also because of the essentially putting clash into one very, very specific issue. When they put clash into one specific issue, me and my partner don't really want to debate this topic. It takes away from the education. Instead of debating all these things we could have, and I'll get to this in a little bit, but we had three main contentions with a bunch of impacts. We wanted clash on all of these so we could actually learn from that. We just don't get that learning in today's round. Now, note that theory is a pre-fiat issue, therefore you should be voting on theory before anything else in today's round. With that, let us get into their case. And essentially, even if you don't buy the theory argument, why their case just doesn't really stand in today's round. So essentially, they came up with a CP of that we're going to exclude socially beneficial investments. And I have a couple of responses to this, and essentially this will link into their first advantage of reducing renewable energy and their second advantage of weakening low-income housing. These are all completely related, and I have like I think like 5 responses to this. The first is that all money will flow through this because socially beneficial is an extremely vague term. It is an extremely, extremely vague term. Like, what is socially beneficial? I could think socially beneficial is one thing. They could think that socially beneficial is another thing. We need a specific, essentially, definition on that because they haven't given us a specific definition. What will essentially end up happening is all money will flow through this socially beneficial capital. When all money flows through this socially beneficial capital, we see the disadvantages of this economic recession, this disadvantages of, well, it's going to be a decrease in financial stability, and we're going to see in global and international ramifications. They don't access these advantages as soon as we say that socially beneficial is vague, and that all money will go ahead and flow through this. And essentially what we're saying is all money flows through there, and essentially there is corruption. Also, in this instance, they essentially don't access any of our advantages in today's round. Essentially, they said that they reduce the chance of economic recession, they increase financial security and the global international ramifications. They don't access any of these essentially advantages that we have today for the sole reason that all money is going to flow through this, and when all money flows through this, there's going to be corruption, and when there's a lot of corruption, that's bad for the economy. And also another thing about corruption is, like, anybody can put money into a socially beneficial situation, per se, and if someone puts money in a socially beneficial situation, then they can get away with a very fraudulent, very risky investments. What we're trying to stop in the first place are risky investments. That's why we're saying if you put in $100, instead of holding $10 in the bank, now you need to hold $20 in the bank. That's essentially what our plan does. So that's actually decreasing financial stability on their plan. Now they have the second, essentially, advantage on their plan of weakening low-income housing. So first of all, they talked about the 692,000 units of housing and how this is going to lead to $30 to $50 billion in the economy, and how this is going to lead to global warming and mass extinction. I don't think they said mass extinction, but they said this is going to lead to a big detriment in the environment in and of itself. First of all, this is extremely, extremely, extremely low magnitude. You have to note that in today's round, they don't essentially link themselves to global warming, particularly because they don't show how they solve for global warming in and of itself. And there's no way they're going to solve for global warming when we give, essentially, I think it was tax cuts to renewable energy sources. There's no way you're solving for global energy. Yeah, I agree that you may be fixing or going towards that effort, but don't let them come up here and give you these numbers of 30 billion, 50 billion, the 692,000 units of housing, because they don't link into these. Essentially, they may link into a part of these. We don't know how much a part of these, but they do not link to all of these. Don't let them come up here and link it to all of these global warming impacts. With that, let's go into our case. Essentially, our case went undisputed. I mean, reducing the chance of economic recession, they said they don't link. They said they don't link to increasing financial security. They said they don't link to global and international ramifications. But essentially, we're telling you that all of these are going to happen as soon as we have this socially beneficial, vague term put into place. So we're saying that these disadvantages on what they're proposing will happen. And I think that's the biggest point in today's round. All three of them still stand today. You can essentially extend everything through your flow because they just haven't responded to anything. And I just showed you how they don't link to this because all the money is going to be flowing through these socially beneficial corporations. When it's funded through when the money's put through the socially beneficial corporations, then you see all these disadvantages of increasing the chance of economic recession, decreasing financial security, and the global and international ramifications, which are all negative in today's round. For all these reasons, I'm in the firmest affirmation.
Okay, everyone ready? So as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to go over theory, then I'll go over on case, and then off case. All right. Start time now. Okay, so first of all, they make this argument that the plan-inclusive counterplans are bad. Basically, the first issue is that we believe in a counter-interpretation, that plans should be the best possible way to solve an issue. Obviously, we are engaging in policymaking. We have this issue of policymaking. If we're not making the best possible issue, then that is a reason to vote against the app, and the app has to prove that they have the best policy. So, for going on to counter standards, we have reasonability. First of all, it's completely reasonable since this is socially decided, since we talk about this issue, since we talk about socially beneficial assets in this issue. Whenever we talk about this issue, we talk about socially beneficial assets. They could have seen this coming. This is a reasonable issue. They should have expected this, and they should have researched it. Second of all, proof of abuse. They've shown no way in which this is abusive. They haven't actually shown arguments which we de-link them from or which we prevent them from making, therefore it's not abusive. They haven't shown why it's abusive. And they make this argument about, lastly, social context. Again, we see this in society. We've seen this issue multiple times it's something to be expected. When we talk about this issue, we always talk about this. So they make this argument of ground skew. First of all, it's not ground skew. As we see, it's a social context. You should prefer social context over ground skew because we can see that it's reasonable that they could see this in the resolution that they should have been able to research it. Shifting ground, again, we're not shifting ground. Basically, we're advocating something that is common in the status quo. There's a reason that we should advocate that, and as we see, they are just trying to avoid making the best policy. Now, going on to their voter issues, basically they say that they want clash on their first three advantages. We don't provide that clash because we link into their advantages. They still have clash and they still have ground, however, on the issues of socially beneficial. Second of all, they want it to be educational. First of all, it's very educational to talk about this because the most education comes from talking about passing the best plan. We can only have education if we talk about passing the best plan, and in order to do that, we have to have the ability to have a plan, inclusive counterplans. Last of all, fairness, again, as we mentioned, social context, we see this issue. We don't actually have to discuss its fairness because it's something that comes up in society. Going on to the AF case, again, on their first advantage, they basically say that we don't respond to it. We don't respond to it because we link into it. As my partner explained, we are solving for all these issues by avoiding the socially beneficial assets. We still link into it. That can be applied to their second and third advantages. So going on to the neg case, basically our counterplan was to do the AF case except to avoid socially beneficial assets. And they argue that this is not well defined. First of all, my partner mentioned there's a legal definition. If they want to look this up, they can look at Volcker's rule exception. They can look at the discussion there. They can look at the Dodd-Frank Act and the Boardwalk Hall versus Commissioner Supreme Court ruling in which they specifically said there's a defined definition for socially beneficial. It's not vague. There's no link to this vagueness when we gave the definition and when the definition exists. Second of all, they argue that all money is already going to flow through this issue. First of all, it's not going to flow through this issue. What we bring up is that when you make these banks buy these assets and on the other hand have them or allow them to buy these tax credits, and on the other hand have to buy assets to offset that, what we see is that they're less likely to buy the tax credits because they're less valuable. When they have to offset these assets by buying other assets, it's no longer as valuable, it's no longer as profitable for them, and therefore we see the disadvantages. Second of all, they make this argument that we can't access their benefits because money is going to flow through these socially beneficial assets no matter what. Again, it's not going to. In their plan, they do not allow money to flow through here. They are specifically arguing that these assets, which are defined by the federal board, or by the board that they cite, that regulation would not allow these assets to be used. Yes.
Yeah. So we come up here and say that all money will flow through this, and you say it won't. Essentially, can you provide some warrants for this, please?
Yes. In their plan, they're specifically banning or requiring a distribution of these two different types of assets. That there have to be the same number of unsafe and safe assets. Now the issue here is that these are considered unsafe assets in the current economy. So because they are considered unsafe, they would be required to be balanced off with other assets. They're not. Because of that, they'd be less valuable. They'd be less likely to be traded. And in addition to that, if they argue that this is risky, it's not risky. As my partner mentioned, it's extremely low probability of these crashing. According to the Novogradac and Company, it's 0.00012% of crash. So it's not going to crash. It's completely safe, and we still link into that. So basically, we link into all of their advantages. Well, they have failed to show any reason that their plan does not link into the disadvantages. The only argument that they say is that it's extremist. And first of all, they have this idea that it's in extremely low magnitude to have this environmental collapse. First of all, what they're missing is that currently we have predictions of going up 2 degrees Celsius. Now, as my partner mentioned, this has huge impacts. What we see is that we go beyond a point of no return. And this point is where the ice caps start to melt, where CO2 starts to come out, or not CO2, methane, and the methane levels increase at a rate that's faster than they can be stopped, and basically it leads to exponential decomposition of these ice sheets. It leads to more methane into the air, more global warming, and they argue that this has no impact and that this would already happen. So first of all, what we are doing is we're decreasing the valuability of these assets. We're making them less desirable. Because we make them less desirable, banks are less likely to buy these assets, which directly makes them less likely to support these assets, or makes people less likely to support these assets. As we mentioned, Congress or the Congressional Assessment Committee is currently saying that these assets are the reason that we are stopping global warming or slowing its progression. So if we drop these assets, if we make them less valuable, we see that this goes away and suddenly all of the global warming impacts flow through. As my partner mentioned, environmental impacts outweigh economic impacts because when an environmental impact enters the round, that could cause the collapse of society, that could cause the collapse of the earth. That's going to always outweigh economic impacts because economic impacts go on cycle. Going on to our second disadvantage, which is that of weakening the housing market. Again, the only argument that they make here is that we're not actually going to have these detriments. Basically, Judge, as you can see, by categorizing these assets, we make them less desirable. By doing this in this way, we're going to create an economy that does not want these assets. When they don't want these assets, they're less likely to actually take part in trading them, to take part in obtaining them, and because of that, they're less likely to create affordable housing. Judge, for all of these reasons, you should vote negative in today's round.
All right, thanks everyone for a great educational round and for staying. For this speech, I'm just going to go over voters summarizing basically the points of negation is one, and why the debate is swinging towards the negation side in today's round. Everyone ready? Yep. All right. So first, basically, let's look at the points that the affirmative team is trying to win on. First of all, they want to win on a theory shell, and that theory, a theory shell that basically says that picks are bad. We should lose because we run a pick. But we've already given you pretty substantive offense on those standards. We've given you a counter-interpretation that indicates pretty clearly, first of all, picks are educational. Picks provide basically a policy-making perspective, which is the most educational way of looking at things, because in the real world, nobody says, you know, this is a reasonably good plan, I'll pass this, even though I know there's a better alternative. So we promote this policy-making perspective that says we should look for the best possible plan. As my partner stated, that's enough offense, basically, that we win the theory shell on education, and that on fairness, this is something they could have predicted, because this is the key issue. Basically, this is the exemption we're getting rid of. This is something that they could have fully expected, and basically, it's not our fault at all that they didn't have prep on this, that this specific issue is well within the ground of the resolution, and that the idea that debating it is somehow unfair to them or takes away their ground is just not in accordance with reality or accordance with the terms of the resolution. We've given you something to offense showing why we went on education, why we went on fairness, so you can't vote on the theory shell. And the second way they could try to win is basically on their impacts on the case. As we've already explained, we link just as well to all of these impacts because there's no more risk associated with socially beneficial investments than the other investments we currently consider safe. Their only response cross-applied to all of our, basically all of our links to their advantages. The only response they made was to say that we don't link to their advantages because socially beneficial is vague, and socially beneficial is a term we expand to include everything. But as we've said in our first and in our second speech, socially beneficial is a legally defined term. You can look up its definition in the second section of the Dodd-Frank Act. So the idea that this term, which has a very specific, very well-defined parametricized legal definition, is just going to expand and occupy everything, and basically that every investment is going to be categorized as a socially beneficial investment, is not in accordance with reality. We link completely to their case, so you can't vote on impacts because the counterplan captures all of the affirmative impacts. So let's look at the voters, basically for the negative side. First of all, just look at the counterplan. Basically what you need to figure out is which outweighs in this round. The impacts of the counterplan, the impacts of the plan, and we think it's clear enough that basically the impacts of the counterplan are going to outweigh. So first, let's look at our disadvantages. They've made no substantive response to either the disadvantage about renewable energy and the renewable energy tax credit, or the disadvantage about the affordable housing tax credit. First of all, they conceded the point that the affirmative links to this, and their only response basically was that the links are lacking, that we don't link to global warming. First of all, they sort of mixed our two advantages together. They seemed to imply that we were arguing affordable housing leads to global warming. We weren't saying that. So basically, we have two separate points, both of which haven't been addressed. First of all, that if we pass the affirmative plan, we would end renewable energy tax credits, that renewable energy tax credits are the main factor that is leading us right now towards towards reducing the effects of climate change. And if you pass the affirmative plan, you put yourself in a position where you will cross the point of no return, which means inevitable environmental collapse thanks to global warming. All of that analysis has basically been dropped. All that analysis flows through. And also they say that this is low magnitude. It's the biggest magnitude impact in the round because in addition to collapsing the economy now, it collapses the economy forever. We depend on the environment for the economy. If there's no environment to provide the needs of human society, there can be no economy. So definitely we outweigh on that point. So basically, they haven't responded to the disadvantages. They've conceded that the affirmative case links into the disadvantages, that the negative case avoids the disadvantages. Now, another thing to look at is basically that we turn the points about economics. as we've already explained, there's a huge multiplier effect associated with affordable housing that accounts for about $40 to $50 billion each year, that when you provide people affordable housing, that benefits the economy to a huge amount of money. They have made no response to this, and this actually outweighs on economics. So even if you believe that environment doesn't outweigh on economics, we should win on the economic points as well. So finally, let's just close by looking at an impact calculus here. So first of all, they have the theory shell. We've already explained they don't win on the theory shell. We've given you enough offense on the standards. We've shown why this is actually the most educational, the most fair way to run the debate. So really, what it comes down to is, supposing that you bought all of the advantages that are on the floor today, which you should not, compare environmental impacts to economic impacts. And what you'll find is that environmental impacts far outweigh, because we've already explained how the renewable energy tax credit is the key thing that's keeping us on track right now. If we get rid of the renewable energy tax credit, we will put ourselves in a position to cross the point of no return. We'll put ourselves in a position for irreparable environmental harm. So first of all, this encompasses economic harm. All of the economic harm associated with the affirmative plan, all the economic harm would be even worse if you look at this environmental dissent. And second of all, this is forever, as opposed to the affirmative plan, which would be a boom-bust cycle. Basically, the crashes they're talking about are temporary crashes, whereas what you're looking at on the negative side is permanent environmental collapse forever, which would preclude economic growth for all of time. For this reason, we strongly urge a negative vote in today's round.
Not 2 voters on why you should be voting for Minister. Let's go ahead and start time. Start with the theory argument. You should be voting on this first and this alone, because the rest of the debate doesn't matter, because this is an a priority voting issue. Essentially, there's a real world impact, and it should take precedence over everything else. Now, they have a few drop standards that the affirmative team actually brought up that they didn't respond to. The first drop standard is that of infinite regression. Let me explain the argument of infinite regression. Essentially, they can run a plan, inclusive counterplan, that is smaller and smaller and smaller until the point that we're debating about whether a comma or not should be placed in the plan. They run in their own theory argument that the affirmative team's plan should be the best possible opportunity. Well, the best possible opportunity is perfection, and perfection is impossible. So essentially, they're expecting something that is impossible of the affirmative team. That is unfair. So go ahead and go into our voter of fairness right now, right here, right now, and go ahead and cast your ballot on the voter of fairness. We see if fairness is not preserved in parliamentary debate, then essentially parliamentary debate will cease to exist as an activity. If one side is always going to be better than the other, the neck can always run picks, therefore the affirmative team always has to be perfect, the affirmative team will always lose. And if this essentially is going to happen, debate is going to collapse as an educational activity. This is a real world impact that should take precedence over any impact that they have brought up in today's round. Go ahead and turn to our second standard of predictability and that of prep skew. They essentially said their issue was a reasonable issue. They talk about this social context. However, I'd like to point out there's so many issues that are reasonable issues. Essentially, our argument is there's no way we can predict which reasonable issue that they want to bring up. And essentially that harms fairness, because we had prep skew in today's round. We prepped the resolution for 20 minutes. We give you a solid reason why you should be affirming the resolution. They picked one niche thing they didn't like about the resolution. They changed it and they're saying, okay, now we want you to vote negative. Essentially all our prep time was wasted because the debate has all been about their niche clash. They got to pick the clash. We didn't get to pick the clash. The resolution is what's supposed to be picking the clash, not the negation team. If the negation team gets to pick what the clash is, we lose fairness in today's round. Go ahead and tie back into our voter of fairness. If fairness is not preserved in parliamentary debate, it collapses as educational activity. This is a priority voting issue. It should go above all else. Then we brought up this argument how they destroy clash. We're only clashing on one issue today, and that is that of the social exceptions, whether or not we should be funding the social exceptions. We could have had a holistic analysis of the European economy. We could have had analysis on India, China, Saudi Arabia. We could have had an analysis on how the United States financial market is growing. But all of that was thrown out of the window because the negation team ran a pick today. Essentially, that harmed the educationality of today's round. We could only be discussing this one issue, which we could have discussed under the affirmative rule, but they can't discuss all these issues under the negation team rule because they're bringing up a pick. So go ahead and tie back into our voter of education. Essentially, if education isn't preserved, less people will do parliamentary debate. That's a real world impact. Now, they only, on their counter interpretation, they only ran offense on education. They had no offense on fairness. Essentially, you should be buying fairness over education because of the analysis that my partner already brought up. Essentially, parliamentary debate will cease to exist as an activity if fairness goes away. However, even if parliamentary debate is not educational, people might still do it. Look, there's a trophy right there. People might be doing it just to win that trophy. We don't know that they're going to be there doing the debate in order for educationality. However, if debate is unfair, people will inherently corrupt because they know this one side is going to have an advantage over another. Therefore, fairness takes precedence over education. So by pretty much every single ways it means, we win on this theory argument. This is an a priority voting issue. They harm fairness, which should take precedence over education. They drop multiple of our standards. So flow that through. Go ahead and vote on the theory right here, right now, today. With that being said, even if you don't buy the theory argument, let's go to our second voting issue. Essentially, delink the negation team from all of our advantages today. Now, they bring up this socially beneficial exceptions argument, and my partner points out that this is vague. Now, they bring up the argument that essentially they have a legal definition for this, but they draw my partner's argument that this legal definition will be shaded because of corruption. But what will happen is everyone will want to be investing in these socially beneficial exceptions. Therefore, there will be corruption within the law. There will be essentially politicians who are going to be changing up these legal definitions so they can invest their money there. So we can see because they dropped this point of corruption, essentially they de-link ourselves from all our advantages. Here's what the argument we're making, the reason they can't access our advantages today. Because what's going to happen is these individuals have to, all the United States banks essentially have to hold a 20% currency unless they can hold a 10% currency if they're doing socially beneficial exceptions. So they'll shade the definition of socially beneficial exceptions. Then they'll say whatever we want to do is a socially beneficial exception. Because of that, we can only hold 10% reserve instead of 20% reserve. So essentially because of that, they de-link ourselves from all of our impacts, and that's why we win on the flow. Because go ahead and value our impacts over theirs on 1, magnitude, and 2, probability. In terms of magnitude, we brought up economic recession. That pretty much outweighs everything they brought up in magnitude, especially their climate change argument. They bring up this argument of climate change. However, they point out it's already bad in the status quo, and that's essentially what they'll be preserving within their counterplan. They don't really show how they're going to be solving for environment or really be changing things up here today. So the probability of their impact's low, and because of the probability of their impact's low, apply the law of total probability. If the probability is low, then the consequence of their event is essentially low, and they have a smaller impact. So therefore, we would win on magnitude here. Then going to our second standard, essentially that of probability. We brought up more analysis of the status quo. Baby boomers, US of rising financial market, European economy. They really didn't bring that many uniqueness arguments. Therefore, we don't know how predictable their plan is in the status quo. For all these reasons, I urge affirmative.